All right, we'll call to order the City Council Workshop Meeting for Budget Discussion Number 1 on August the 12th, 2024 at actually 3:04 p.m. With that, roll call and certification of quorum. Madam Secretary is certified that a quorum is present as all members of the council are present. And I think I got a note from you, no citizens signed up. So with that, presentation, overview and discussion regarding the 2025 budget. Before we do that, Trent, just real quick, I want to thank just the opportunity on the outside here. Thank each and every staff in the budget process, whether it's in the individual department all the way up to ultimately finance and the budget team there, as well as the CMO. This is all an undertaking. It's the single biggest document that we approve every year, and in fact, if you look at the charter, I think it's council shall approve a budget every year. It's one of the things that we have to do, and it has to be a balanced budget. So it's probably the most important thing that we do on an annual basis. Certainly, we have a lot of things that come down our pipe throughout the year, important, but this is where we all get to focus, and this document will set us up for the rest of the year. So I want to thank each one of you for, like I said, your input, your direction, the hard work, and everything that took to get here. So with that, Trent, we'll turn it over to staff for presentation.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, Council. I appreciate everyone being here early on a Monday for a very, very long Monday, and all of our staff as well. I echo what the Mayor said. This is an ongoing process that really never stops throughout the year. It goes on continually throughout the year. This is kind of the beginning of the culmination of that, to work through the next couple of months to get a budget and a work plan for our fiscal year 25. So I thank everybody for all their efforts there. The theme we've tagged with this budget is planning for the future, preparing for any eventuality, and preserving the community. And just a couple of examples of what's in this budget that exemplifies those is planning for the future. We again have additional fire apparatus as we try to catch up on where we've been behind on replacing those. Also a focus on improved customer service and investment in our people, which is our biggest resource, our most important resource. And so planning for the future there. And then preparing for any eventuality. We've got additional public safety capacity in this budget, a focus on asset management in our enterprise fund, and then preserving the community. We've got a streets crew in here, additional summer camp capacity to serve the needs there as we fill up very quickly every year when we do that. And then Old Town revitalization to continue those efforts, as well as cultural arts master plan implementation. So just touching on this evening, one of the first things we're going to touch on is our budget development process. So as I mentioned, that's an ongoing year-round process. We've done a little bit of municipal budgeting 101 in our early budget input session, but we want to go a little bit deeper into just exactly what the departments and the budget team go through annually to develop these budgets. They just don't kind of start with where we've been and move forward. We really ask them to examine everything they do and build that from ground up, and examine every item that is in there from a standpoint, is it justified where it is being budgeted at. Then we're going to jump into the general fund, look at the overview and big picture of that, the property taxes, other revenue sources that go into the general fund, and then expenditures and supplementals. And then we'll follow that with our tax-backed debt fund. So once we get through general fund and the debt fund, we'll pause for any questions or any discussion, and then we will jump into the enterprise fund. We'll go through the overview of the enterprise fund, the rates, a preview of where we are on the model, and then supplementals associated with the enterprise fund. And then we'll pause there again for questions, and then we'll move into an overview of the EDC, that fund. So just to give a preview of what Budget Discussion 2 next Monday holds, so that if you've got questions in those areas, of course, we'll take those questions, but that's why these things aren't going to be discussed tonight. We just got to, we got to kind of break this up into pieces to be able to get through it in the time we have available. So next week, when we start on Monday evening, we will follow up on any budget questions from discussion one or any questions we've received before or after this meeting. We have received quite a few questions already. A lot of those we'll answer, try to answer if they come up tonight, but be assured we will get those questions answered. There's just a lot of them, so we got to work through those. And then next week we'll delve into our compensation for our employees and a rule of 80, which is a new recommended add to our overall benefits package. And then we'll have the full-time equivalent comparisons to other cities that we go through each year. We will then go into our internal service funds, so motor pool, IT, as well as facilities, and then all of our other special revenue funds like CVB and the other ones. And we'll go through all those revenue funds as well. And then we will touch base, although we've already had a workshop on the FY25 capital improvement program. We will again refresh and just give a real quick overview of the planned projects and the funding resources for those projects. So before I hand it off to Rachel to jump into the budget, I do want to just call out specifically where we do have everyone within the city that works on our budget every year. Just specifically our budget development team, want to thank them for all the work they've done to get us to this point. Rachel Winslow, our head of office and management and budget, Chan Tran, Lori Stewart-Turner, Erica Weekly, Humera Ansari, Kendra Murphy, and Victor Brownlees, Ron Fraser, Joel Hardy, and Megan Flowers Phillips. And then Josh Lee is always a part of that group, helping us get prepped and ready for presentations and everything else. So team effort, and thank all the department heads, their folks that have helped us put this together and get us to this point. And at this time, I'll hand it over to Rachel to present the budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. To begin the budget discussion, the role of the budget is outlined. Our budget serves as a policy document, a financial plan, and operations guide. Additionally, it's a communication device to our public. The budget process is ongoing throughout the year, and this model begins in February when the Council holds its strategic retreat. Information from the strategic retreat, including the strategic priorities and milestones, impact the budget development process. In March, the city takes a thoughtful approach to budgeting with value for our organization and taxpayers in mind. Departments are instructed to enter projections for the current fiscal year budget at the amount actually needed to fund existing services. They take this opportunity to recognize savings, and for the upcoming budget year, no base increase is given to the budget. Departments are instructed to enter their budgets that support only existing budget services, and in the event that there is an increase, they are instructed to provide justification. Budget entry continues into April, and supplementals or new services and personnel are requested by the departments along with the budget entry. Internal services such as HR, IT, and facilities collaborate and confirm costs with departments prior to submission. Once budget entry closes in April, the budget team conducts a line-by-line review of each department's entry. For several weeks, meetings are conducted with the city manager's office, department leadership, and the budget team to review submissions. Historical and year-to-date spending are reviewed to ensure the reasonableness of budget requests. Changes may be made to projections and to the upcoming budget submission if needed based on this review. In June, the results of the meetings are analyzed and budget amendment number 2, or projections, is brought forward. Additional non-recurring items may be funded at this time as fund policy allows. In fiscal year 24, the only additional items were in internal service departments. July is the final evaluation of the available resources and priorities. Departments present their top supplemental priorities to the city management team, and city manager's office prioritizes the list of supplementals to be budgeted as funding allows. At the end of July, property tax numbers come in and the final budget is developed. In August, the proposed budget is submitted and the budget discussions take place. In September, we hold public hearings on the budget and the tax rate, the adoption of the annual capital improvement plan, as well as the adoption of the budget, tax rate, and non-development fees. And then the cycle continues in October with the beginning of the fiscal year, as well as budget amendment number 1 or carryovers, and the year-end closeout into February when the process begins again. Our budget overview for fiscal year 25 shows that the City of Pearland is a people-focused organization. Our annual compensation goal for the city is to provide competitive market and step adjustments annually to ensure that we're keeping pace with the market and that future compensation studies have a less significant budget impact. For fiscal year 25, the proposed budget includes that eligible employees receive an effective 5% increase. This is a 3% market adjustment and their 2% advancement through the salary range, otherwise known as the step increase. For uniformed public safety, there are additional changes with uniformed police officers receiving an 8.8% increase and uniformed firefighters receiving a 13% increase, with these adjustments bringing the pay plans to market. Our non-exempt, non-public safety employees that are at their maximum step will receive 2% of their base salary as a one-time payment. What is not included in the fiscal year 25 includes an additional $4.2 million in street funding needed to maintain the transportation infrastructure, 51 qualified general fund vehicle replacements with a $4.8 million replacement cost, $5.9 million in additional supplemental staffing requested across the general fund, including $4.5 million for public safety staff, $400,000 for Parks and Recreation staff, and an additional $1.5 million for Internal Services Department staff. Additionally, there's $2.1 million in non-personnel requests primarily related to the IT technology replacements. We are continuing to not fund the capital replacements for IT and facilities in fiscal year 25, so there are no capital lease fees for these funds. However, the overall general fund big picture is positive. The general fund represents a balanced budget where our annual revenues, including transfers, exceed our annual operating costs, and our general fund balance is above the 25% or 90-day policy. Will exceed the policy minimum by $93,405. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Victor Brownlees to discuss property taxes.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I'll dwell for a moment on the primary source of revenue to the general fund, which is obviously property tax. And just by way of preamble, if I can remind us all that a number of years ago, the state legislature changed the process by which tax rates are calculated in the state and set some parameters around the amount that cities would be allowed to levy on their taxpayers. One of the calculations that results from this change is the no new revenue rate, and you'll hear people talk about that a lot. The no new revenue rate is a tax rate that would allow us to collect exactly the same amount of money that we collected in the previous year. So it's like saying to a business, your turnover next year must be the same as this year, therefore you must cut your prices. The proposed budget includes a tax rate suggestion to you of 63.5 cents, which is a cut in the current rate of over 2 cents. And we do that, go back, I want to dwell on that first slide a little bit longer. Go back, there. So we do that to reflect two things. One, the inevitable, ineluctable, overwhelming cost of inflation to the economy. We are not immune from the effects thereof. And we have limited that in the general fund to about $3.75 million. That's 2.5 cents on the tax rate. Furthermore, we have included for your consideration proposals to invest further in your priorities: police, streets and drainage, fire, and customer service. All of those investments that we're proposing to you equate to about $1.5 million. That's a cent on the tax rate. That's how we get from the no new revenue rate of 60 cents to the proposed tax rate of 63.5 cents. Okay, let's move on. These are breakdowns of how that's comprised, split between the debt fund, which we're proposing a reduction in the tax rate for, with a slight 1/4 cent increase on the O&M side. Moving on. Okay, so taxable values. What's been happening across the 3 counties within the city? Overall, our appraised values are up about 8%, not necessarily the galloping increases that some may have thought. It's still a substantial year-over-year increase. So right now, gross, we're at about $18 billion of value across the 3 counties in the city. This chart hopefully gives a sense of what has been happening to the tax rate over the last number of years. You can see it has fluctuated, moved up by 2020 and has been coming down since. We'll set aside the 2023 aberration, but you will see the trajectory is downward and that continues, hence the recommended property tax rate cut of over 2 cents. So if that is what is eventually concluded from your deliberations and the budget as proposed is set, the rate will be, as I say, 63.5. This on the screen now is an analysis that shows you the effect on arguably an average home in Pearland. So our take, the city's take of a resident's tax bill is about 30%. In 2023, it was 35%. So our taking is decreasing. The 2% tax cut, given the uplift in property values that I just talked about, would equate to an annual increase of about $60. 1 cent is worth $1.5 million to the general fund. It costs about $30 to the taxpayer a year.
Victor,
Yes.
can I ask real quick? There's tons of info on the slide that's been presented that's in the budget book. In the past, do we have the slides accessible anywhere now, or do we have to wait till afterwards? Because we're all feverishly trying to take notes and look at what you're saying.
Okay.
I don't. Is there any way to
Am I
get
going
access
too
to
fast?
that? Yeah. I know it'll all be public facing.
Yes.
Probably tonight, but is there anything that can we get the slides emailed to us now?
Can we get it, Rich?
Can we convert that to PDF? Can we get that converted to PDF and share it? It was just
I
wrapped up
normally ask
this.
for that.
It was just wrapped up this afternoon, so that's.
No, it's a good question. It is hard, because I went and looked, thought maybe they posted what
Kendra's going to be sending it over in just a moment.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Do you want to wait for that, Mr. Mayor? Do you want to move on?
I think we can go on. Looks like we're going to have that here in a few minutes, so that'll be fine. Go ahead, Victor.
Okay, go back.
You go to slide 23. There we go.
So that is to restate, as I mentioned a moment ago, a cent on the tax rate is worth about $1.5 million in revenues to general fund. That's $33.5 a year, $2.80 a month to the average taxpayer. And you can do the math, should I say, of what a half cent is. At this point, I'll hand over to Rachel to talk about the other revenues in the general fund.
Thank you, Victor. Sorry. No. All right. So comparing our general fund revenue from the fiscal year 24 amended to the fiscal year 25 revenues, we can see that overall there's a 7.5% increase in our revenue, primarily in property taxes. We're projecting a 1.7% increase in sales taxes. The largest adjustment is to the miscellaneous revenue, which includes revenue from interest. Beginning in fiscal year 25, the debt service fund interest will now remain in the general fund, as well as interest attributed to the cash CIP fund, Fund 500. Transfers in for fiscal year 25 are also increasing due to a calculation that includes the administrative support necessary for the capital improvement plan. Instead of reimbursing for only engineering staff, support staff from the city manager's office, the Office of Management and Budget, HR, and legal are also included in the transfer cost. The administrative transfer from enterprise fund was also examined to make sure it was an accurate reflection of the administrative support from departments not included in the enterprise fund. So again, some of those similar departments, city manager's office, budget, HR, and legal were included in that transfer, which is why those transfers are going up for fiscal year 25. Our sales tax revenue for fiscal year 2024 saw slight sales tax growth, certainly slowing from prior years. So the fiscal year 25 proposed budget is presented with a projected 1.7% sales tax growth. And as always, we continue to monitor sales tax throughout the year and will adjust it at budget amendment 2 if needed, up or down. Sales tax revenue is budgeted at $31.2 million in general fund, 25.1% of total general fund revenue, and the Pearland Economic Development Corporation is budgeted for $15.5 million in dedicated funds for those uses as defined by state law. 81% of general fund revenues do come from three main revenue streams, which is our sales tax, property tax, and charges for services. The primary component of charges for services is the TERS administrative fee reflected in the finance department. For general fund expenditures, we like to look back and remind ourselves that we have a balanced budget where our revenues exceed our expenditures, and we do meet that 90-day policy, and we maintain all of our existing core services as well as the supplementals indicated in later slides. So comparing the fiscal year 24 to 25 expenses, we see that overall it is a 4.3% increase from the amended budget. By category, salaries and wages make up our largest component because, again, we are a people-based organization. Miscellaneous services, our third category, is a functional expense category in accounting that includes citywide and departmental expenses that do not fit into other expenditure types. These include our public notifications, publications, cellular phones, internet, telephone, air card, professional services, landscaping services, mileage, postage, printing, temporary staffing, professional development of all kinds, certifications and licenses, memberships, copier services, street lighting, and utilities for city facilities. Each account in the miscellaneous services category is broken out on the department details pages and include more information about what is budgeted in that account. For fiscal year 25, we took a look at the how, what, and why of what we do, and we evaluated which supplementals to include in the budget. So our supplementals by strategic priority include a records analyst in the city secretary's office, which is a net gain to the budget of $14,000. The remaining cost for the records analyst was offset by recurring expenditure reductions. In Safe Community, we have police officers, each with a vehicle. In Police Patrol, an animal control officer with a vehicle, a crime scene supervisor with a vehicle, and an EMS clinical manager. Under Sustainable Infrastructure, we're including a project management team of 3 people for the capital projects team, completely offset by that capital projects administrative transfer we discussed earlier, and a street maintenance team of 5 FTEs to help with our street program. Under Connected Community, we have a Chief Customer Experience Officer and a West Pearland Summer Camp program expansion, which is completely offset by revenue, as well as additional recreation attendance for our Parks and Recreation Athletics program. Again, completely offset by additional revenue that will be generated from the program. Moving on to our tax-back debt fund. The debt service fund, or tax-back fund, is the fund where the city budgets the revenue and expenditures from all tax-back debt. Expenditures in this fund pay for non-enterprise system debt and MUD rebates. And our tax rate has 2 components. This is where the revenue generated from the debt service property tax goes. Tax-back debt is paid for by property taxes, and the primary driver of our tax-back debt payments are the CIP projects. For fiscal year 25, our debt service rate is proposed at 30 cents with an estimated levy of $40.5 million and a total tax revenue with frozen values included and penalties at $40.7 million. Our debt service fund reflects that we do have a ending fund balance of 10% of our annual debt payments. The MUD rebates and returns for fiscal year 23 and 24 are reflected in the fiscal year 24 projected budget, and the updated MUD payments are reflected in fiscal year 25 and going forward. In fiscal year 25, we are continuing to pay off debt for additional TERS defeasance reflected in the interest expense. That is both our principal, interest, and TERS defeasance for fiscal year 25. The other line item is the MUD rebates. And while expenditures do exceed revenues for fiscal year 25, that is because we are taking advantage of those MUD rebate returns received in fiscal year 24 to pay down some of our debt in 2025. With that, we'll pause and we'll take requests for information or questions and make any updates by consensus. Thank you.
So maybe just to wrap up before we jump into questions, you know, this is a general fund budget that's largely driven by inflation and the pressures on our pay plan, with a handful of supplementals that are tied to the strategic priorities. And then did want to touch base on the debt service as well. Rachel mentioned that we are using those MUD rebates to help bring that debt service rate down, and that there also is a large, as planned, TERS reimbursement that's paying off that TERS debt as we have planned in that model of those monies coming back in to the debt service fund as well. So all those things helping to drive the debt service portion of our tax rate down. So with that, hand it back to you, Mayor, and any questions. Thank you.
Very good. We'll open up for questions, comments up to this portion of the presentation. Open up to council. No?
Thank you, Mayor. So Trent, the question I have is our debt service. Can you go back, Rachel, to the slide that shows the rate from last year to this year on the debt? So proposed debt service is 30 cents and it was 32.5 roughly. Is that correct?
Yes, it was 3229.
Okay. And we're able to buy down this debt because of the payment, that extra payment we received from the MUDs. Is that correct?
Yes, we overpaid in fiscal year 23, so we received that back in fiscal year 24, and then our payments for fiscal year 24 were also reduced.
Okay. So I guess the question I have is, in the general plan or budget, I guess, we're proposing a penny increase. Trent, is that correct? I mean, this tax rate, what is it, like 32 now?
It goes from 33.
It's a quarter.
33 and a quarter to 33 and a half.
Okay, 33 and a quarter to 30. So it went up. Okay. So I guess, yeah, So I guess the question I have is, if we did not have, so overall we're getting a break of 2 cents, right? Approximately 2 cents.
Yes, little over.
So I guess the question I have is, I would like to know if we hadn't had this extra payment to pay down the debt, bringing it down to 30 cents, what you're telling me is you guys would have proposed a budget to increase the tax rate. Is that fair to say?
I don't know that the numbers would have worked out to that extent. I think where we were with the debt service as a whole and based on valuations coming in, it would have been higher than the 30, but I don't know that it would have pushed us above the current tax rate.
So can we run some numbers to show what that would have been? Because I guess my question I'm trying to understand is, I get the overall tax rate has gone down in your budget by 2 cents. Then the question I have is, it's because we made a mistake, we overpaid, and now what we're saying is, look, we're going to bring down the debt rate by 2.5 cents, but we're going to go in the general fund and bump it up a penny. The net is you're going to save 2 cents. I guess what's bothering me is when I was going through this budget, I do apologize, I've not gone through all 400 pages, is that we're going up, the values, if I'm not mistaken, have increased by 8% overall, roughly. But we're actually, because of our screw up or mess up of overpayment, we're using that as an advantage to bump up the general fund by saying, I guess I'm looking for a deeper discount. Are you following where I'm saying? Because it looks like it was a mistake we made on the debt side, but we're using that as an advantage to kind of bump up the general fund tax rate, the OME, but then we're still giving, we're giving you a 2 cent discount. If we hadn't made that mistake, we wouldn't have overpaid it. We would have kept that money and made a payment earlier, but I don't think the appetite would have been to see, I think you would have, if you would have proposed this budget, we would have gone up on rate from last year. I think you would have sharpened your pencil further to say, hey, values have gone up 9% or 8%. We're not going to go up at the same rate. So I think the OME rate would have come down, in my opinion. It's my opinion.
So I don't think that's really the way we look at it. We look at it from a standpoint of, what are the top priorities on the operating side, and what's driving that is the inflation pressures, and that's the inflation pressures on the things we buy, material, supplies, equipment, and as well as on our pay plan. So we had a slide in there where it talked about that is basically, was it 2.5, 1.5 pennies on the operating side driving that, and then we had another penny in there for the supplementals that we did include in there. So we really start with looking at it like that, and then one of the final things we're going through as we go through this is looking at that debt service side and where is that rate. Just a couple months ago when we were going through working through selling our debt, working with our financial advisor, John Roebuck, his model showed it was actually a little bit higher than this, but we were able to do a couple of different things and still bring that down further. So, although we had our rate a little higher than it should have been last year and collected a little bit more, that was only a portion of what's driving this down. The rest of what's driving this down is the values being up and, just where we are on the projects and things like that. There was, how much of this was general fund on the MUD rebates? About 2-3 million? Yeah, so it was about 2.5 to 3 million. The other part went to the enterprise fund as well. So while if we didn't have that sitting in the bank, this may have been a little bit higher. But last year's was could have been brought down if that hadn't been part of that as well. So.
Ms. Mona?
Yeah, thank you so much for a presentation and all your hard work. I do appreciate the 400 pages. I do have a question on page 127. I believe it's chart account 115. There's a budget amount for sorry about that, let me get to that page, for 1.3 million for office and management. And then when I looked at the supplemental, I noticed that it wasn't highlighted, but then on page 34, you have 5 new positions. So I'm just trying to understand what that 1.3
The
allocation.
page number she's talking about is actually out of the budget, not in the presentation.
Yeah, page 127 of the binder.
So the Office of Management and Budget will be new for fiscal year '24. So these are all existing budgeted positions. It's myself and the 4 budget employees. We were previously split between finance, 100, 130, 100, and the enterprise fund utility billing division. So those are costs related to the budget team and the budget development, including costs to the appraisal districts for our appraisal values. And those are the professional services that came over with that.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I just have a question regarding the market adjustment for salaries. I mean, first of all, I do think we should pay a market rate, and I do believe in cost of living increases. But COLA is currently at 3.2, but yet we're projecting a 5% increase in salary. So I just wanted some more information on that.
So this is on the non-public safety
That's correct.
folks, right? So they're in a step. We have that pay plan and a step plan as well. So there's basically a 3% market adjustment for the overall pay plan, and then if they're eligible to advance to the next step, that's an additional 2%.
So was that projected last year? Are we catching up? I'm just trying to get some more information as why it's at 5%. I mean, I understand what you just stated, but are we catching up with previous year?
No, I think we're just keeping that with the market, much like we are for the public safety.
Okay. And then on page 12, there's a recommended, I think the study suggested that we should expend 5.9 million for our PCI maintenance, yet we're only allocating 1.3. So I guess the question that I have maybe to council is, how are we going to make up that shortfall, because we need to invest in our streets and our roads. So
we do, and let me maybe put a little context around that. We've been in that $1 to $1.5 million allocation to that for several years. We do know when we need more. We went into this budget fully trying to add to that, but if you'll recall, late last year we did allocate $3 million to our streets program from some available bond funds that we had. That will help, that are currently helping out. And then there's another 1.3. There's another 1.3 in this budget that was part of what was discussed when we allocated that 3 million that is going towards our streets teams to do that asphalt street maintenance. So while that's kind of a one-time deal and we still need to allocate more dollars there on an annual basis from the general fund to meet that need, we do have some other resources going into that late in 24 and in the 25 budget. So that's why we took this opportunity to prioritize the streets crew that was requested over adding to that infrastructure fund, because as we put those dollars in there, as we put that 3 million and that 1.3, and as we try to increase increase that up to what is needed ultimately every year. We also need the crews to do the proper maintenance on those asphalt roads. We can go in and repave and rebase and put new riding surfaces on those roadways, but if we're not back in there within a handful of years doing the crack sealing and the other maintenance efforts we have to do on those streets, they'll fall apart much quicker and that investment is lost. So we prioritize this year that crew to help with that maintenance, because right now we've got one crew that really they struggle with everything they have to do just to keep up with pothole filling. So we need to be able to have additional capacity to do that, as well as the other preventative maintenance work on these streets. So prioritize that this year over additional dollars in that fund, just to make sure we are maintaining what we are doing previous to now and going forward.
Questions, comments? Mr. Brown?
Thank you. I appreciate y'all putting all this together. I want to kind of expand on what she was saying as far as roads. that's probably the number one thing that I hear about people from. I'm sure it's probably the number one thing y'all hear about citizens from as well, as the condition of our roads. And we've talked about
Well,
it.
prior to Beryl, anyway. So.
Well, fair enough. Right now it's debris. Fair enough. Fair enough. I stand corrected for the next 60 days. So when I approached looking at this budget, one of the main things I was looking for is how are we increasing funds for road repairs? Sounds like we're not. And not to get into the weeds on individual things, I think there are some opportunities that we can look at, maybe doing some other things in future years or making some other adjustments. But I think we have to, I 100% agree with the road maintenance crew. I think we have to have that or you can't keep up with what you're doing. But I think we need to take a hard look at this and see if there's some ways that we can either make some cuts or, and may not be the most popular thing, or look at maintaining either a flat tax rate or a tax rate that's in between the 2-cent cut and the flat rate to be able to start addressing these roads. Because every year that we don't fund this, it gets worse, right? So we're just continuing to play catch up. So at some point, we've got to make tough decisions and we've got to say, what do we need to do for the long term? So I don't know what the rest of council's appetite would be to have that conversation. I love the idea of cutting taxes. I pay them too, so cut taxes as much as we can. But if there's no room in here that we can say we need to put 500,000 into roads like we were talking about, then I think we need to have a conversation on the tax rate, because not putting more money into roads, I don't think is an option. I think we have to figure out how we put more money into roads.
I think we might be getting ahead on the roads, but while you guys were talking, a question came to mind, and it said in there that we were looking at, was it 5.9 is what we needed to set aside for the roads? But also in here, aren't we hiring additional road crew? Will that bring that cost down?
So that cost is the estimated cost that we need to be putting into the road network annually from a standpoint of rebuilds, reconstructions, chip seals, crack and joint sealing, all the different.
If we have our own crew, will that come down?
They'll be doing a small portion of those things. They're not a road crew that's going to go out and do major paving. Road paving. They're going to go out and they're going to do crack sealing and joint sealing. They're going to do pothole filling. They're going to do minor repairs and those types of maintenance type activities. So I would think of them as very much a road maintenance crew as opposed to a road building crew. So it would impact that just very, very slightly.
Okay. Can we go, I think it's slide 20, 19 maybe? Well, Victor, you're talking about the inflation rate of 2.5 cents. And do you know what rate we used for inflation to get that?
That was
Is that based on like inflation's at 4% or 6%?
It's not really a calculation of an inflation rate. It's saying that the 3.75 that's been added to our budget that deals with the increased cost of materials and supplies and the pay plan is all due to inflation. And the cost of that 3.75 million is 2.5 cents.
Okay, got you. So essentially by, I guess this was it 14. Anyway, by this slide, you're basically saying that with our proposed budget, we are going to do a no new revenue tax adjusted 2.5 cents, and then we're actually just only raising the budget 1 cent. This summarizing that, right?
Yeah, so this was really to relate the budget as proposed to the no new revenue rate. So the new revenue rate compared to the budget proposed is 3.5 cents difference on the tax rate. And so this is, what you said. It's showing basically 2.5 cents of that is the pay plan and inflation. And then the other 1 cent is the additional public safety, the streets and drainage crew, and customer service related.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Ms. Kay, did you have a question?
did. I came a little early and asked some of them, but I did want to ask something about the overtime for police and fire. Is there any way that the officers and firemen that you've asked for, is that going to cut down on the overtime, possibly?
So I'll let Chief jump in. One of the things we talked earlier, and I forgot, is that, when we look at that, when you add additional people in public safety, they come with a certain amount of overtime with each person. So, you are adding from that standpoint. Ideally, you're bringing that down as well because you got enough people that are working regular time to fill all your hours that are necessary, as opposed to having to bring people in on overtime to do that. But I think it's as we've grown, it's difficult to say that you can make those dollars up one for one. And so, that's why we are taking a deeper dive into that overtime number. And we decided when we did budget amendment number 2 and saw that big increase there in FY24's budget, to do that deeper dive to better understand what's driving those numbers and why, and is there a way to put some better understanding and potential control over what that number is going forward, as opposed to just kind of being what it is every year. So I don't know if there's anything else. There's Chief Randall to add there.
Thank you, Chief Randall.
I would add that this is actually to get our allocated staff and patrol up. So it would be a very minimal impact. This request for these officers is much more to offset the growth in population. We've got several major developments going on in Pearland right now. And so, yes, it'll have a minimal impact, at least initially. As y'all know, it can take us up to 16 months to fill an empty position. So, there will be some salary usage there. However, if we end up with cadets, then we're still paying out. We're just paying at a lesser rate until we can actually get boots on the ground.
Okay, thank you. So it's 3 really, 3 or 5?
So our original request was for 5. However, keeping it an odd number is what made sense, because one of the shifts currently has one more officer than the other 3 shifts. There's 4 patrol shifts, and so we're trying to keep those equal at this point.
Okay, thank you. And I had another question, but lost it. And
Go ahead.
can't find my other question.
We'll be here.
We'll come back to it.
Yeah, if you have it, we'll catch it on the
Circle back.
We'll circle back. He's here.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for staff for the input and time to get this budget together. I had a couple of questions. One, first I'd like to ask Carrie on the southbound playground replacement. Can you kind of talk about what that is, what we're doing?
Sure, absolutely. That supplemental request is a request utilizing the Parkland Dedication Fund to fund that. The Southdown Park Playground is our oldest playground in our inventory right now. It has reached its end of useful life. Each year we spend quite a bit of money. Over the last, I'd say about 4 years, we've spent a tremendous amount of money just trying to make repairs. The fall zone, most importantly, it's a rubberized pour-and-play surface, and it has reached a point that we can't patch it anymore. And so at a minimum, we have to replace that surface. And then we continue to invest in these temporary repairs to the playground structure itself. And that is very costly, and they're just temporary, and they continue to break. And so in the Parks Master Plan, it was identified that the playground be replaced this year. And so we're proposing to replace the entire playground structure and the surface.
So the fund that you referred to, is that coming out of the general fund?
No, that's Parkland Dedication Fund.
Okay. So the reason you didn't see that in the supplemental discussion tonight is it's coming out of park dedication funds, and so that's one of our special revenue funds we'll cover at next Monday's meeting in detail. So
Okay.
that's why you didn't see.
That's what I was just curious where that was at, and I was kind of drawing a blank. And then also I've got one for, if Chief Spires is back there, yeah. On the animal control officer that you're looking for, do the animal control officers actually work in the facility itself, or what exactly is their job requirement or description?
Well, I'll get started on this, and then Chief Savage will follow up. So yes, they work in the shelter itself, and they answer calls every day. The issue we're having is they're spending so much time in the shelter taking care of the animals that we're kind of delinquent on some of the calls for service.
Okay, I mean, because what I was looking at is I can understand where if they are tied up with, I guess, work within the facility, would we be better off hiring some folks to do that on a daily basis and have our officers out, patrolling or doing the calls, depending on what type of setup that would be needed?
So everybody we hire there is an animal control officer, so they can do both roles. And I'll let Chief Savage expand on that just a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so there are certain areas. We do actually have an outside cleaning service to help with some of the cleaning, but state law or the recommendations as far as our animals that are in quarantine for either bite cases or being observed for various diseases, as well as our cats, we're doing all those ourselves. So there's a certain amount of cleaning that we have to do that we can't really farm out. So we try to take care of the animals in the shelter while maintaining services out in the field. We've had a lot of turnover, and that kind of hinders our ability to be out in the field, answering those calls for service and picking up the strays, et cetera.
Well, what I was looking at is as far as the actual day-to-day, the work that's being done in the facility itself, is it required that you have an officer do that? Or could you have just, I don't know what you'd call it, an employee that's a staff member that is not a law enforcement personnel that would actually be doing the work required?
Okay, I think we might have some miscommunication. So when we say the animal control officers, those are actually just they're not police officers. So they can enforce the ordinances for animal services, et cetera. So everyone that we have, with the exception of the supervisors and the program coordinator, is an animal control officer. A while back, we got rid of the animal shelter attendant designation to provide us with some more flexibility so that whoever is there that day, they can either work in the field or work in the shelter. So that's kind of what we did with that.
Okay, that's what I was just curious, because I didn't know if it would be advantageous to have, if you call it a civilian, I don't know what the classification would be.
Yeah, all of them over there are now animal control officers.
Okay.
My understanding is that the way it was when we had the two different ones is, if you didn't have enough animal control officers, you couldn't do any of the field work.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you had plenty of those, but not the attendants, then those things weren't getting done, or you were pulling people out of the field. And it just gave the department a lot more flexibility to be able to have it the way we are now. And then just would want to point out on that position is when we committed to build that new animal shelter as part of the 2019 bond program, there was, always a known need that had so much more capacity in it than our old animal shelter. The recommendation was we would need 4 additional animal control officers for that facility, and we've only added 1 so far. So this would be just the second of those 4 that were recommended when we decided to build that. So we still have some shortages there.
Okay, I was just curious, just more an inquiry there. And then Trent, being, I guess, one of the 3 sitting up here at the dais when we went through our debacle with the tax rate, could you kind of help us understand that, one, we have faith in our estimations here so that everybody understands?
Sure, if we can maybe go to the 2 slides that show the taxable valuations. They're the bar charts.
Somebody's phone's on.
So as he finds those, a couple things. The tax rate worksheet, as we've talked about significantly in the past, is a very complicated state worksheet. What complicates that further for us, City of Pearland, is we're in 3 different counties. And so the 3 different appraisal districts send us their information, and that information has to be deciphered and put in the proper place on the tax rate worksheet. Those 3 appraisal districts send their information in 3 completely different formats. And then a couple of them actually tell you some of the numbers and which box they go on the worksheet, but they don't tell you every box that you need to fill out. You got to figure that, you got to go through it and figure these things out. And after the situation we have, the Brazoria County tax assessor collector who used to do our tax rate worksheet is no longer doing that. So last year we made it through, did it right, but it took a lot. This year we actually contracted with Purdue Brandon and Robin Garrett, the former county tax assessor collector, works for them. So she worked through us on the tax rate worksheet. And so through those interactions with her, with myself and Victor and Ron and Rachel, and the questions we asked and what she was able to bring to light of how that tax rate worksheet works, I feel very confident in going through that process. And then taking a look at this is basically what we wanted to make sure we took a look at year over year in growth in the different counties. So you see Brazoria County here going from 14.2 to 15.3. That was a lot of the 10% homestead cap still coming onto the rolls. And then, of course, a modest increase there in Fort Bend. It's a much smaller piece. And then looking at Harris County, the 1.89 to the 2.08. And that's where, I think if 2 years ago we had looked at this, we would have seen, although overall big growth, kind of, like we're seeing this year where it's $1.5 billion, we would have seen how the bulk of that was all in Harris County, and there might have been a problem with that. So we are looking at this to make sure the numbers look like the growth reflects what we're seeing in the region and what's expected. So through that process, looking at this, and if we can back up one more slide, taking a look again at the total city taxable roll versus, and then the TERS itself, just making sure those growth rates match what we would expect. We feel good about the valuations and the tax worksheet.
Okay, I just wanted to understand that we are working on that and that we do have somebody that we do trust. And
yes, sir.
And are happy with that. And my last comment, as far as the road stuff, I'd be willing to have a discussion on what the right way to try and tackle that.
Sounds good. Just kind of want to highlight the tax calculation worksheet. I think what Trent just went through there, our staff is more actively involved in that calculation now than previous. Not to say that they were completely absent of it, but a lot more active in the development of that, which I think is good. But I want to follow up on a couple of questions. Ms. Cade asked a question about overtime, and I don't want to, I don't think there's a real number to eliminate overtime in the police department. Same thing in the fire department, because there's way too many factors that pose, in that. But Chief, if you could share, how many officers would we need to really make a significant dent in overtime?
So, first off, I think it's important to kind of talk about where that overtime is used, right? So it's not just, especially within the police department, it's not just overtime that is being paid to try to bring staffing up to a minimum, right? So, for example, you can have a homicide case that occurs on a weekend and pulls in a dozen personnel all weekend long, and literally they go 24, 36 hours, right? 12 people. So anything like that's going to have a major impact. In addition to that, we've got a number of special events throughout the years that officers participate in. Any major events can call in additional personnel as well. So there's going to be certain forms of overtime that are just going to exist. The other routine, for lack of better words, impact on overtime for the police department is our officers work a 1280 schedule, which means that they work 84 total hours in patrol over a 2-week time period. 4 hours of that is actually built in at an overtime rate. Now, some of the officers take that for comp time. Some of them take it for pay. It actually ends up being a very cheap way for us to add personnel over the entire 2-week time period, because we were able to actually add 5% additional personnel by having each person work an additional 4 hours. And as you've seen kind of in our staffing studies as we compare to other agencies. Most of those are working some sort of 12-hour shift similar to us now. But for those that aren't, it actually gives us a little bit of staffing boost in that category. As far as our overtime that is related directly to patrol allocated staffing, right now we are paying, I'd say on average, about 1 to 2 officers per day per shift to keep our patrol staffing at a minimum level. Now the impacts of that are right now, and I know Councilman Carbone had come by the police department recently and was able to see, I want to say we're, I think, 12 officers right now that were in some form of training, field training program. They're cadets, they're waiting for the academy. We've got a couple positions that are on appeal that, we can't fill those until. So realistically, once we get those positions, boots on the ground, that'll allow us to fill some of those gaps. And so that's a long way to get to your final question, which is, if you look at our staffing over a 3 to 5 year time period, we are looking departmental wide, professional staff, police staffing, everything, drones, all that stuff, right about 27 personnel.
That's significant. That's context is everything, Chief, and I'm glad for you putting it all in context, because we hear overtime and it's just people immediately think that this officer, that officer are working 3 hours more, 4 hours more, 6 hours more. While they do that from time to time and have those opportunities, that's not the case all the way around. And regardless of how many people we hire, there's still going to be opportunities for overtime that are there. The other thing I was going to say, there is a point hiring additional people can cost you a lot more money, simply because there's outfitting them, vehicles, benefits, all of those kind of things that if this officer over here just simply added 10 more overtime hours and through the year all the way through, you're not adding those vehicles, you're not adding that maintenance, you're not adding a benefit level to it. So there's a break point, or there's a balancing act that has to go through all that as well. There is a point in time where just because of the growth of the community, we need to add officers, period, and it goes to the basic staffing of the department. So
and I'll tell you, when it comes to the 12s for the patrol, that was actually one of the things that we looked at. Is it's actually cheaper to pay each of those officers that extra 4 hours than it is to add staff and add extra cars. The administrative overhead costs for human resources and finance. I mean, every time we add somebody, we know that has an impact on, not only the department, but the support staff around the city too. I mean, that's another person that HR is dealing with when, potential FMLA or whatever the case is. So we found it to be pretty efficient, and we've been running that now for, I think we started in 2009, so 15 years that we've been running.
And that's why I asked the question the way I did, because this is looked at on a either annual basis as well as 3 to 5 year window. So we aren't overstaffed, but we don't need to be significantly understaffed either. And so there's a point that we look at it for those exact reasons. Like you said, it's cheaper to add the additional 4 hours than it is to add a body. And so I say that all of our departments, public safety departments included, look at each one of these types of line items to make sure that we're doing it efficiently and effectively. All of this is expensive endeavor. It all is. But at the end of the day, we're looking at it efficiently. And so that's why I wanted to ask that question for the record, which will help that, in like over in fire, I mean, I hate to say it, but they're having babies faster than, most hospitals around here. And so when you have that and you have those folks go out on FMLA and those types of things, it doesn't matter what you budget. You can't necessarily know that. And so that has an impact on your overall budget and overall staffing. And same way, you can't just go on the street and hire somebody and put them to work tomorrow. That takes time to plan through. So these are targets. These are, where we can feel comfortable that our coverage of our city our city is being covered in a safe manner, an effective manner. At the same time, things like that just happen. And like you said, we have a major case, could happen tomorrow, and we've got half a dozen officers or more all of a sudden on multiple days of work that we have to pay for. So I want to follow up on Ms. Chavaria's question on the 5% real quick, because part of that is the step. So the COLA is the 3%. Okay, it's the step that's the additional 2%, and that's for each, if I understand it correctly, each one of the steps are being increased 2%. And that keeps up with the market adjustment. Does that make sense? Okay. So I wanted to make sure on record, and not every employee has a step increase. Every employee will get the 3% as proposed, but not every employee will get the 2%. Right. So you want to ask that more specifically?
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor. So that was one of my questions, is how many of our employees qualify for the 2%, right? Is it pretty much everybody, or is it 10%? Like, what percentage of our staff would qualify for the additional 2%?
How many are making the next step?
It is a majority of the non-exempt, non-uniformed staff. Police and fire also progress through their pay plan. Anyone hired before July 1st of 2024 and anyone who's not on any sort of performance improvement plan is eligible to progress through their step.
So is it, when you say majority, is it 50%? Is it 90%? Do we know?
I don't know if we know a specific percentage, but it's close to probably the higher.
Yeah, it's probably in the 90% range.
So when we're talking about a 5% increase, it's pretty much a 5% increase across the board.
It is. So employees that are not in good standing, that they would be not eligible for that.
Fair
so
enough.
those that are eligible.
As we grapple with how to fund priorities, we're definitely a people first organization, as we should be, because we have to be outward facing and serve our community. I think it would be valuable to me anyway to know the 3% COLA, fine. What does 1%, 2%, what does that look like in a dollars number? I don't expect an answer to that like right now, but if I could get that, like this is what we would add if it were 1, if this were 2, just to have an idea of where we can kind of grapple potentially in that arena.
Sure, and I think we would look at that across the board so you can see it in all the different categories.
Yeah.
The civil service as well as fire plan as well as the rest of the plan.
Okay, and I had 2 other questions, so that'd be great if y'all could get back to us on that, or to me. On slide 25 of this presentation, which I think was page 20. There it is. Yep. Okay, so that one shows an increased revenue 7.5% year over year of 8.7 million, right? And then jump forward to the same slide for expenditures, which is page 27, slide 30. Yep, right there. So the delta there is 5.1 million. So we have an increased revenue of 8.7 million. We have an increased expenses of 5.1 million. So there's a $3.7 million difference there that I don't understand where that is. Our revenue went up by 8, our expenses went up by 5. Where's the delta? You see the question I'm asking?
I think the answer is in the amended 24 budget. Go back a slide.
Sure. So we're comparing the FY24 amended budget, which is basically the final budget after budget amendment number 2. And so that includes carryovers from budget amendment number 1. So any carryovers from FY23, and then the final projections for FY24. So you get an amended budget there where our actual expenditures were more than our revenues. So the revenues were like 114, expenditures 117. And that was what was in the final budget amendment number 2. And that's what's being compared to 25.
Right. The chart says that it's 24 amended,
Right.
25 budgeted, right?
Correct.
So 24, sorry if I'm being dense.
No, it's-
So 24, we're basically have a $3.7 million shortfall in 24. That's where that difference is?
So there's a $2.2 million deficit in fiscal year '24 as a result of revenues being 115.7 and expenditures through budget amendment 2 being 117.9. In fiscal year '25 proposed, our revenues exceed our expenditures by 1.3 million, but with an operating expenditure budget of 123 million, our fund balance for a 90-day fund balance also grows. So the difference is those increased expenditures over revenue in '24 and our additional contribution to fund balance in fiscal year '25 to maintain that 90-day balance.
So the makeup of the 3.7 that I'm seeing is the shortfall from '23, the overage in '24, and the increase in the fund balance minimums.
Correct.
Those come together to make the 3.7.
In some shape, yes.
Okay. Then I had one other question, and this was just a clarification question for me, and I know you're probably right. We got ahead of ourselves on roads. We'll get to them. The pavement condition index called for 5.96 million allocated, which is not necessarily in repairs in general on the ground. That's overall what we're budgeting towards roads to maintain our current state of our roads, correct? It's not to improve.
That's correct.
That's just to maintain.
That's correct.
So we actually need more than that if we're going to improve our road conditions.
Yes, I think, if you break that down between, asphalt and concrete roads, I think if we were to start infusing those kind of dollars into our asphalt street program, it would seem like an overall improvement. Especially, and we would see it in the asphalt streets, the pavement condition index for those. I think when you get into the really big dollars is when you get into, we get into some of the neighborhoods that are concrete streets and they need more than just a panel replacement or minor repairs. And typically what we've done to take care of a lot of those neighborhoods is we've done that in a bond program. So we had a bond program in 2019 that included, I think, about $15 million to do neighborhood street reconstruction, and that was concrete streets.
I don't mean to imply that if we put 5.9 million in that we wouldn't see
it,
across the city.
right.
No, we would definitely see improvement.
Yeah.
But we'd just be kind of, other roads that need work would be deteriorating while we're getting ahead of things.
Correct.
We're repairing things while those go down.
Yes.
But wasn't that just to keep and maintain the score of 74?
The current levels.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Right. Current level.
Yeah,
So if
not improve.
If we wanted to take that 74 and take it to 79.
Yeah, well, we've been at
put in-
76 and we dropped to 74, so that 5.9 or whatever it was just to maintain.
Just to maintain 74. Correct. Yeah. We would see roads improve across the city if we put it in there. We'd see other roads deteriorate. So
Which is always going to be the case.
Right.
I mean, it is a cycle.
Ongoing.
I guess the main reason that I bring that up is because at our current 1.3, I think that highlights the need to get closer to that 5.9 because that just keeps us where we are. If we don't want to continue to decline, we've got to start pushing in that direction and push hard.
So, go ahead. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thanks, Mayor.
I said I'll try.
If you can go to slide 22, I see we're dropping the Sea of Pearlands from 35% to 30%. The road and bridge on this example is going from 1.9% to 11%. Is that the correct rate, going from 4 cents to 30 cents?
We'll check that again and revise it if it is an error.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a huge jump that everybody should be screaming about. Or let's make sure we get some of our local city roads funded by that drastic increase. But I'm afraid if that rate is off, then maybe our percentages aren't as good.
Real quick, while you're at it, show an example of a home in a mud district as well, because it does have an impact. I mean, typically I've always used, if you're out of a mud district, you're in the 30% range. If you're in a mud district, it's about a 25% range, give or take. So.
I would also, Mayor, a lot of us live on Pearland ISD, and the tax rate is much different.
Yeah, if you're in Alvin ISD, and you also have ACC, I mean, The school districts are roughly the same, but you have that additional tax of Alvin Community College, which is going to drive the city's percentage share down a little bit. Doesn't affect the dollar, it affects the percentage.
And then also on slide 25 and 30, I've fielded a bunch of calls over the lovely miscellaneous and transfers in. And if there's a way to provide kind of a high-level summary, I know you listed out a ton of them, but give us some real numbers in terms of, this is the revenue side, the bulk of it's interest income, but maybe reconcile the transfers in and out, because these transfers in are just the general fund, so we'll have transfers out on slide 30 that go to the transfers in on your internal service funds, and I follow it, but I think it'd be helpful for everybody to see that, not just from the fund level, but from what folks would call the city. You tell somebody about transfers in and out, they don't care. It's all City Hall. So something very high level, I think, would help.
We can do that, and then for those interested in the detailed budgets by department, you can see the breakdown of each of those miscellaneous line items under the topping miscellaneous.
All right, that's all I had, Mayor.
But even if there's a cheat sheet for us to know where they are in the budget, so when you do get that call, you have a way and a place to go see it, would be good. So just that right there. Not that we field a ton of calls over that, but you do get calls over it. And then you're like, okay, a 400-page document, I got to go put it together and find it. So having that would be good. Any other questions, comments, or because we're going to move on? All right, next level. We'll move on to Trent next.
Oh, you want to go to the enterprise fund?
All right, we'll jump right into the enterprise fund.
Let's go.
In there.
So for fiscal year 25, the proposed operating and debt funds combined for the water and sewer funds or enterprise fund is $118.2 million. The bulk of that is debt, and then also our salaries and wages. So what is driving the expenditures in the enterprise debt fund growth? We have in progress a number of capital improvement projects, including our Berry Rose project for $229.4 million, JHEC wastewater treatment plant expansion for $80.5, our surface water plant for $175.5, and our Longwood water reclamation and facility decommissioning for $38 million. This is a total in over $500 million in capital improvement projects that we've completed or are working towards completing within the last 3 or 4 years on an ongoing basis for Berry Rose and Longwood. These are having a large impact on our water rates. So the fiscal year 2025 revenue changes, an 8% rate increase is proposed for fiscal year 25. We're required to bring in enough money to pay for our debt and operation. Increased consumption does help to some extent, and our rate increases are the main way that the city brings in the necessary enterprise fund revenue. When we sell debt, we agree to have a bond coverage ratio of 1.15, and our enterprise operating fund balance must remain above 15%. So an average household in Pearland using approximately 6,000 gallons of water will pay an additional $8.09 per month under the 8% rate increase proposed. This slide shows the history of rate increases across Pearland, and we can see that periods of low rate increases result in spikes to the consumer, and our proposed rate increase for fiscal year 25 is 8%. This slide has a lot of information about the different residential usage and meter sizes and the rate change that they could see under the proposed 8% increase, including for fast food restaurants, sit-down restaurants, and small office commercial properties. Comparison bills for the city of Pearland with known rate changes are shown here. Pearland maintains roughly its same position year over year as in past years for residential 5/8 meters with 6,000 gallons of consumption. This next slide shows the comparison bills for the fast food restaurants with 59,000 gallons of water consumption. And again, Pearland stays in roughly the same position year over year when compared to other cities. So what is driving our rate increases in the enterprise operating fund? We have $79.8 million, which is a $7.4 million increase from the fiscal year 24 adopted budget of $72.4 million. This does reflect a full year of surface water plant operations, which we were able to reduce at mid-year 2024. Increased maintenance and operations costs. We have seen inflation hitting the professional services contracts in the enterprise fund pretty hard. Compensation changes as outlined, and the addition of 5 full-time staff members. Year 2 of cash funding the contribution to the Gulf Coast Water Authority Shannon Water Pump Project, and 2 cash-funded CIP projects. We have not cash-funded any CIP projects in a number of years, so that is an additional cash expenditure for fiscal year 25. In our debt fund, the expenditures are paid for by a transfer from the operating fund as a transfer into the debt fund, and the fiscal year 25 enterprise fund operating budget will add $3.5 million increase from the fiscal year 24 adopted budget of 25.5. This next slide reflects our enterprise operating fund income statement, where our expenditures do exceed our revenues, but we do maintain the bond coverage minimum of 1.15. We exceed that at 1.4, and we continue to have unreserved working capital, and our operating reserve over policy is indicated. Our enterprise fund debt statement shows that we do maintain a balanced budget here, and we are able to meet all of our debt obligations for 2025 and continue to meet those required ratios here as well. Our next slide shows our proposed rate model seen in the multi-year forecast. Here we have our proposed rate increase of 8% for fiscal year 25, which is a large reduction from our proposed 17% rate increase shown last year. This increase is due to the particularly dry summer, decrease that we saw in fiscal year 2023, which saw us bring in revenue over and above expectations. For fiscal year 24, the MUD rebates returned to the enterprise fund from the overpayments have a substantial positive impact. So, as a result, the proposed rate increase for fiscal year 25 is only 8%, and going forward is also 8% and 7%, taking into consideration all capital improvement plans and anticipated debt payments for those years. We are maintaining our ratio of 1.15 and exceeding our minimum combined financial policy 15% ending cash and 25% ending cash. At 8%, the rate increases for the next years are stable and consistent for our residents, causing no spikes. The Pearland Water supplementals by strategic priority all fall under the sustainable infrastructure category and include a 4-person asset reliability team spread between the Utilities Administration Division and Wastewater Division, and a Deputy Director of Utilities in the Administrative Division. At this time, we'll pause for questions.
Back to you, Mayor.
All right. Any questions, comments from council? Mr. Patel?
Trent, and I guess the question would be to council, if there is any appetite to look at how do we alternately fund this by using other source like the EDC funds. Maybe we can sell some bonds and help this tax rate or the rates go down and take on the debt through another source. Is there an appetite on this? I think we need to consider this for long-term planning. If there is any kind of discussion we can have today so we can put some guidelines for staff to kind of look at those options.
So if I could jump in on that, the next part of our presentation is the EDC. And I think we'll see through that we've got on the state highway or the FM 518 project, the utility relocations required for that we have the EDC funding that 100%, and that's estimates somewhere between 18 and $30 million. So that's going on the EDCs on their cost versus going into the enterprise fund. And you know, we can look at, you know, other options as far as where that makes sense. And you know, the EDC has done a lot of the water sewer improvements as well. So I think we're taking advantage of that to a large extent, and we'll see some more details on that when we get into the EDC's budget.
Anybody else? Questions, comments? I have a question on that, Mr. Patel. I mean, would you have at what level would it make a dent into, it goes back to the rate model. You know, if it's coming from that source, where does it make a dent in changing the rate? You know, we could go and offload and do that into the EDC, but even they have ultimately a limited resource. So where is it? 20 million? Is it 30 million? Is it 50 million? At what level does it make a dent in the 8% increase?
Well, I think that's a good question, Mayor. I guess my point is we continue to put on this debt on new plants that we need. I guess at $15 million revenue, we can certainly sell a significant amount of bonds for 30 years. And I know we're going to talk about it today. We have a lot of projects on the obligations that we're going to issue, I guess, on the 6:30 meeting that are, you know, when you look at some of those costs that we're going to put on an obligation, they may only have a lifespan of 7-10 years, but we're going to take on a debt for 30. And I guess my point is, when you have $15 million in the bank and you're spending $1.3 million on overhead to run that department, wouldn't it be fair to say the citizens probably would want that money to be spent on debt, whether through water rates or through reduction of the debt rate on our budget, property taxes? I think it's an alternative to look at.
And no, so I'm asking the question. I mean, do we spend, if we spent $20 million additional money over the EDC to do this, does it move the needle on from 8% to 5% or 4%, or does it just move the needle 1%? I don't know the answer to that question. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, and certainly that's a good question, and I would hope staff could give you that answer. But again, I think, you know, to be bold, to be very honest, I would tell you go issue a $100 million bond on the EDC's books if you can, right? And use that money for the infrastructure projects that we're talking about. We keep hearing about roads. We keep hearing about these other projects. Use the money. I mean, it's possible we could. It's going to be a bold move. I mean, yeah, $20 million may not move it at all. But if you do a $100 million bond, maybe it does. And I mean, I guess you got to see the financial models on how it works out. It's just an option I think council needs to look at.
And I think it's a good option to explore. That's why I'm asking the question, because at some level, then you've taken our EDC department, and we're no longer in business looking to attract companies. There comes a point in time you can leverage them to a point where, yeah, they write a check for debt service, but there's nothing else there to attract business.
Well, Mayor, if you kind of look at their budget, which I'm looking forward to going through, majority of their funds are not going through incentives. If you kind of look at what they're budgeting for incentives, it's kind of scary. So, you know, on a $15 million, it's not that we're giving 25% to incentives to attract people, right? We're spending a lot of money on infrastructure.
Which is an incentive to a lot of those companies.
Sure, but it is
it's
also
not a cash incentive, but they wouldn't be here unless the road was there.
Yeah, but at the same time, that money could also be spent on citizens, right? The people who are actually paying that money in. So it's I mean, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. So a couple of quick things. We got to always keep in mind when we talk about spending those dollars, they have to be related to economic development. And so I think when we go through that budget, we'll see we've got the 20% dedicated towards infrastructure that's separate from even the utility stuff. And, you know, that what that does is with everything that is planned for, that everything's on the books, will bring down their fund balance and have the EDC selling debt to be able to move forward with some of the projects that I would consider more economic development, incentive-based infrastructure projects. But yes, most of what they pay for and build or their funds go to is infrastructure. Some of it's much more related directly to a particular project. Other is just in general support of economic development. So I think we'll get into all those details when we get into the EDC's portion of the budget.
Any other questions on? Oh, Mr. Tooman.
And I think we can come back next time and say, hey, here's what additional alternative sources into the enterprise fund, how much you have to impact the rates.
So I was just going to say, if there's some options, I'd love to see it. I think I expressed my concern about this rate model when we did the CIP project. I'm also looking at the budget, and I'm also looking at that we're also our overheads going up with some of the changes in the budget for this. I think when we talked about this rate model during the CIP, you said this was kind of a worst case scenario, and we were going to work hard to get these percentages down. So if you got some options, and I'm not saying the EDC money worked really hard to get their debt down, and I'd hate to see us do a $100 million bond. But anyway, if you've got some ideas, I'd like to, in our budget session number 2, see what you
Sure.
have.
So we this started at 17% when we were running the model last year, and because of the drought, we sold a lot of water, a lot of revenues, and then with the mud stuff. And I don't even know, last year, I'm not sure if we had it built in for the 518 stuff to all be funded by the EDC, but those changes got us down to the 8. I think we showed at the early, or we showed a couple months ago when we showed this, we were in the 10% range. So we've been able to work that down a little bit further.
We were at 14 the last time we looked at it.
14. So there's possibilities, but we're at a point where we think at 8%, if we start driving that down further, we're going to see 27, 28, and 29. We're going to see those percentages blow up much larger. So this was kind of the happy medium to where it kept it kind of steady. And one of my concerns right now is that we're having the opposite of what we had last summer. We're having a very, very rainy summer, and that's going to impact our revenues. And so we're trying to be conservative here to make sure we don't do something with the rates this year that wind up with the rates increasing more than projected in the future years.
Questions, comments?
So I understand, or I think I understand, let me correct that. I think I understand that there's multiple factors. Obviously, there's running the water and sewer system, but there's the bond coverage ratio that we have to maintain, and then there's the reserves that we have to maintain, and those are kind of the 3 driving factors behind the rate, correct? Okay. So if we look at, yeah, that's what's up. This chart right here, help me understand moving forward into 29, our bond coverage ratio required is 1.15. And so in 23, we're at 1.42, in 24, 0.31, 25 is 0.4, 26 is 0.6, then 0.78, then 2, then 2, right? So under this rate model, we're improving our coverage ratio year over year, and we're increasing, I think, our reserve. What I don't see on here is what is our required reserve dollar amount.
So the required reserve percentage is the next to last row. So that's where you see that's where we get out to 29, and it's kind of the driving factor.
Okay, very bottom.
Right.
Okay, so by the time we get to 29, we're at our minimum on the reserve.
Correct.
And so what that's stating, if I'm trying to dumb this down for myself, that year over year, even with these rate increases, we're still operating at that top orange part at a net loss every year. So our reserves are continuing to decline year over year.
Buying the rate.
That's correct. So that's what I was stating a moment ago. If we took 25, and ran the bond coverage down and the reserve down by lowering that, we would see that start to impact 26, 27, 28, depending on how much we pulled it down. And that's something. We can show some options there as when we come back next week as well, if there's a desire to take a look at how that impacts the future.
Well, I would
like
say
you said, it's our crystal balls aren't real good because we have so many factors that go into them, especially the weather, and that's one of the things that's really hard to project. Last year when we were projecting 17%, we really couldn't conceive that we would get it down to where we are today, but we did have a fairly extraordinary drought. We were selling just about every drop of water we could produce for 2 months. And so that drove those revenues up and really impacted the rate increase for this year. So, a lot of factors in that, but we can bring back next week, what if we did this? What does that do to the ratios? What does that do to the future years?
So, Member Patel, to your point, I'm open for anything that we can come up with that makes sense, that will reduce the impact on the everyday taxpayer for certain. I appreciate a lot of conversations I've had with staff that y'all seem to have the same mindset. We got to do what we got to do, but we want to keep the impact as low as possible because ultimately it's the people paying for this. It would be interesting to see if there was a little bit of wiggle room in there. But lastly, for me to understand that, so the only way, or we would drop the bond coverage ratio to get closer to our required by lowering the percentage, which would also increase our annual loss. So our reserves would decrease faster, right? So even with this model, over the next 5 years, our water and sewer system is still not paying for itself. Ultimately, at this rate model, it's not paying for itself. Those reserves, where did they come from? Because they're eventually going to run out. Losing $1 million, $4 million, $7 million.
So those reserves are coming from that dry summer in 2023, and we do specifically budget to maintain those reserves. They are the driving factors to meet our enterprise fund requirements. So when we've proposed our rate increases in past years, even as early as 22, 21, we're always keeping those ratios in mind, and we're not proposing anything that wouldn't allow us to meet those. So when we did the 13.1% in 23, we couldn't project that dry summer, so that helps us build into our reserves. We couldn't project the wet summer in 24, so we'll see if we meet our projected number, but the 14% rate increase that was adopted was designed to meet those bond coverage reserves. So if we do have this wet summer in 24 and we don't bring in that revenue, those are the reserves that we'll be able to match.
Carbone?
Yep, thank you, Mayor. I've been around here for a little while. This rate model, we have to look at this in the historically and out to 2029, because we could say drop the rate to meet your minimum bond coverage and your minimum financial policy. And we may get a decrease in the rate, but we might be looking at a 25% increase in the next year. And if you go back a few slides where you show that rate right there, I was up here for some of the big spikes and some of the zeros, and nobody's happy with 8%, but I like 8% better than 14. And I don't know, with the infrastructure that we've got on the ground, when you start looking at comparable cities, they're gonna surpass us in rate. Staff and council before me has done a great job in getting the water rights and the surface water, and we're gonna be able to flush our toilets and trust the drinking water, especially once we get off Houston, more so than any surrounding counties or cities. So that's where it comes down, is that rate model. And I think what I've learned over the years is, we can sit up here and say we want the rate to be 2% increase this year, but we're all going to be squirming next year. And so I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. I understand why the staff presented it as such. The one thing I will point out, if you go to slide 50, this is our comparison for surrounding for residential, and we're on the top side, but not a huge standard deviation away from the norm. But if you go to slide 51, we're clearly an outlier here on the business side. And so I don't know if there is something, as Member Patel mentioned, from EDC, but this change was done a while back, and we're just beating our small business owners over the head. And I'm sure Mr. Patel sees that in his water bills. And so I guess I'm cognizant of that as well, is when we're talking about the small business, we have no homestead cap, we have no relief there, and then we're taking it on the chin from a structural billing standpoint. That's all I had, Mayor.
Yeah, and Ms. Kay just asked me, can we fix that? We could. We would have to lower the rate for business, but that would increase the rate on homeowner. So the point that Mayor Pro Tem just made is a few years back, we changed the rate model and the rates based on meter size. So the bigger your meter, the higher your base rates are. And so, sure, a large, 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch, certainly the 6-inch meter is paying a lot. There's less of them, but they use enormous amounts of water, and they end up helping you and I and everybody else on our residential rate. So the only way to fix this is increase rates on residential. And so, but to the point, at what cost? At what point do we become uncompetitive for somebody to be here from a business standpoint simply because, our rates are what they are? So I think that's important. Real quick, do go back to, I think it's 48. That was where it was showing the, right there. So I want to highlight something that's on here, and that's FY22 and FY23. FY22, we sat up here and had a proposed 9% increase, and proposed for 23 at that point in time was 9 as well. So 9 and 9. And we talked ourselves into lowering the rate 5 points or 4 points down to 5%, and we made it up the next year. And instead of having a more predictable flatter rate, we ended up with another spike. And I think one of the things that if we can come up with is that predictability, which is where our rate model is going.
And this slide in 22 had, it was like 29%, and then followed by a 22% projection for the outlying.
So staff and everyone involved has done a yeoman's job getting this to where it's a little more manageable. 8% is 8%. I don't want anybody to think we're callous to that, but it's not 14 or 17, which is what I think was on the books a year ago. And then, we got it to 14, and then now here we are. In fact, I think the last time we looked at that, we were expecting maybe 10%, but it's even been below that. So could we buy down a little bit more? We could, but at what cost? We could be looking at next year instead of 8%, it cost us and go to 12%. And so I think if we can build in some predictability for our homeowners, that's a lot better than this spike all the way across the board. And, I use this slide often. You see the zeros. So there's 5, 6, 7 years over since 2008, we've had 5%. And one of those 2%. And had we foresight, and I don't want to, it's not criticizing a council, you know what you know, and but we know more now than what they knew in 2010. And so had we put minimal 3% increases across the board on those zeros and infrastructure banked that, what would our rates be today? We would still have an increase in rates because of the projects that we have going on, but we could have a lot more predictability in the rate model. We certainly would have lowered those 16% and that 13 and 14%. They would have come down a little bit and been more manageable had we done that. So those are just lessons learned that I've even talked about. If we do come up in outer years where we have a 0 is being proposed, that you still do a CPI something and bank it somewhere, because you're going to need it, or whether it's cash project. I'm glad to see we're doing some cash projects as opposed to debt. But my question to that would be, if we didn't do those cash projects and did do debt, what would that free up on the rate model? I don't usually it's a trade-off. And so those are the issues that you have to look at sometimes. With that, Ms. Chavarria?
Yeah, I just have one more question. When does the surface water plant go online, the one over in the Shadow Creek area in the west end of town?
As soon as TCEQ will let.
I'm sorry, what was,
Surface water treatment plant.
what was the
When do we
question?
expand it? When do we expect surface water treatment plant to go online?
We're very, very close, getting to the last steps with TCQ. David, you want to chime in?
Oh, there it goes. Excuse me. Well, Mayor, Council, just a quick update. We are producing water from the surface water plant. Right now, we're producing it, but we can't put it in the distribution system until the TCEQ gives their blessing, for lack of a better word. We've got all the samples collected. We continue to run as we're required to do during their analysis or their assessment. So we are producing water at a fairly significant rate, but we're using it to keep the transmission lines flushed and clear. I don't know. Yep, Sean is here. I think we feel pretty comfortable in saying by the end of September, and we're hoping that to be the worst case, but it's TCEQ bureaucracy and they've got a job to do. They want to make sure that we're providing appropriate water to our citizens. So I can't fault them for that.
So along that same line on our JHEC the third basin, where are we at for having that wrapped up?
Well, I've been here just over a year, and it's always been 2 months. Starting 14 months ago, 2 months.
So is it 1 month now?
No.
Oh, the answer is yes, it's coming.
In fact, Roy told me just today that now they're hinting at potentially October.
It's 2 months, David.
Yeah, exactly.
That's much like the 35 North project when I got here. Every time we asked TxDOT when it was going to happen, it was 2 years from now.
They just didn't tell you what the base year was.
Exactly.
So,
We're close there too, but a lot of
same thing with TCEQ, or is it contractor issues?
Construction-related complexities.
And it has been difficult there.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And the hurricane didn't help, nor did the rains. It's complex.
It's fair.
Are we treating flows there? I mean, I know surface water, we're actually making the water. Are we treating flows at JHEC?
Oh, yes. It's been online throughout the entire rehabilitation project. It's just getting the new portions in service has been the challenge.
So the new portion's not in service.
Correct.
So we do have some of the new basins online, correct? It's the rehab of the old basins that's remaining. So we did get new basins online, and that's been several months. And then the project included going back and completely rehabbing some of the existing basins. So the renewal of those basins, getting them recapitalized is what's remaining.
Trent's exactly right. I stand corrected. Some of the new is online, but what was there is now offline to get the equipment upgraded and replaced in them. So we had 3 basins. Today we have 3 basins. Eventually we will have 6.
Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Just before we move on, I want to clarify, we do not issue debt that outlives the life of the asset it funds. I want to be absolutely categorically clear about that. We do not do that.
Thank you for that. One question I had was in line with our water and sewer system. There's a proposed asset reliability team. How is that being funded? Is that general fund? Is that enterprise fund? It's
Anything that's in the enterprise fund is funded by the enterprise fund, so that's funded in part by the revenues we generate.
so that
Or wholly by the
420,000
revenues we generate.
is funded by the water rate.
Correct.
Okay. That was one question, or that was a question. The other thing, kind of a little bit to Mayor's point, I think we can very quickly get caught up in percentages and not look at real world impact. And so slide 49, which I think is page 41 of this, yeah, is that one that it can get real scary real fast. And I've had a lot of people stop me and say, well, you know, you add this percentage and that percentage and my bill's going to go crazy. I think it's important to highlight, point out to people that under this rate model, on average, we're looking at an $8 increase, right? It's not doubling or tripling people's water bills or even 25% increase to it. Sometimes I just feel like citizens that have talked to me get lost in the percentage and don't really understand the real world impact. So I appreciate this slide being in here because it can kind of show you your real tangible application of what we're talking about.
And to that point, you know, 6,000, 12,000, you know, small office or whatever is one thing, but then I look back at the person that all they pay is the minimum, right. and we have a lot of seniors that pay 2,000 for 2,000 gallons a month and don't use 2,000 gallons a month. They might use 1,600, they might use 1,500. They don't quite get to the 2,000, and so their bill is up $4.17. Right. So I'm glad to have this in here because that helps. And I do field, you know, calls from, you know, people who are going, I don't even use the 2,000 and I don't think that's fair. And that's a question we can, you know, if we want to go back to only being billed for what you use, we could do that. But who pays for that difference? And it gets spread throughout the rate model. It won't be a huge difference. In fact, utility billing should be able to query, you know, how many residential homeowners are across our city that never get to the 2,000. That'd be a question to know. You know, is it on quote unquote one hand, or is it, you know, several hundred, or is it several thousand, or is it very, very, you know, minimal? So, because it is an impact, they are paying for quote additional usage, and there's many factors that go into that. There's a certain base that goes into delivering water for every single user, regardless of how much you use, and that's where that rate is, and that 2,000 is based on. But we do field that question. So, questions, comments?
Just the only thing is, if you go back to the rate model, that 8% is compounding over 5
Sure it is.
years. So to say it's only 8%, it's only $8 compounded over 5 years, and you are looking at a 30 or 35% increase. So you're not doubling their bill, but I mean it's a significant raise. So I don't think I'd minimize that.
Well, I don't think anybody's trying to minimalize it. It's wrapping our head around it. I'd rather be flat with those increases than major spikes.
No, and I certainly appreciate the perspective on that. You're right. It is a compounding rate, and you know, over a 5-year period, you are looking at somewhere in the ballpark of $60, $70 a month to an individual over that window of time. I just don't want people to panic, I guess was my point, but I'm certainly not minimizing it. But at some point, just like what we're talking about with roads and everything else, you know, we have to fund this stuff or things are going to not work.
All right, let's go on to PEDC. I think that was next. Yep.
Okay, so we're going to jump into PEDC, and Matt Buchanan, president of the PEDC, is going to walk us through their budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. So just going to real quick run through our FY25 budget and then talk about some of the highlights of our 5-year forecast, which I think is germane to some of the conversations we've been having here this afternoon. And just as a reminder, the Board of Directors approved this budget in their May meeting after conducting a public hearing, which is required by law, and that the corporation bylaws require the budget be approved by both the board and city council. So as you can see there on your screen, we're proposing revenue of around $21.3 million, proposed expenses of about $42.6 million, or about $21.3 million over our projected revenue. Of the proposed $42.6 million in FY25 expenses, $34 million is earmarked for infrastructure improvements, or about 80% of that total project. So always want to stress that our budget is an infrastructure budget. I think if you go back through the corporation's history, I think when we did our 25-year anniversary piece, we talked about we'd spent over $100 million on infrastructure. And I would say all that infrastructure is infrastructure the city is responsible for. So like the Bailey Bridge, the McCard Bridge, water and sewer lines that we've put down 35, down 518, extension of Kirby. Those are all be projects that otherwise would be projects that would be borne by the city. So there's really three major infrastructure projects in our FY25 budget for $26.6 million, representing 62% of our expenses. The first one is for the Hickory Slough Sports Complex. As you'll remember, that was a project that the board and council agreed on last year in a way to take that off the debt service so that the city could procure additional fire trucks that are needed. And then as a part of our agreement that we also did last year in 23 with the board and council, both passed resolutions itemizing projects in older parts of our community where we wanted to improve infrastructure. These would all be roads, as we talk about PCI, would all have very, very bad PCIs. And so we've been doing a number of these roads. We just made about $4.5 million of improvements in Old Town. This next street that we're proposing to do in FY25 that we're under design right now is Industrial Drive. And then also a project we've been talking about in the Smith Ranch Road area, and this is an area where the city's getting ready to invest major funds and has been investing major funds in the reconstruction of Smith Ranch Road from just north of Broadway up to Hughes Ranch Road, would be to extend sanitary sewer to this area. We're going to have a brand new road in this area, but the area is not going to develop because of the lack of sanitary sewer service. So in the budget, we're proposing to issue about $4.7 million in bonds for Industrial Drive. And then, as you'll see in the next slide, the existing fund balance will drop because we are proposing to do Hickory Slough with funds on hand. So as you can see, that's just a summary of the revenue and expenses, but you can see our beginning fund balance that we're projecting for the beginning of the year is about $31.5 million. And the ending fund balance after we do those infrastructure expenditures that we just proposed would go down to about $10.1 million. The next slide just kind of goes over some highlights in our 5-year forecast. The first one that Member Patel talked about is how much we're spending in business development. So these would be, right now we have between FY25 to 29 about $1.7 million committed in assistance to companies. Now these would be projects where we would have a loan agreement with that company and there would be a job creation requirement. And so then we have budgeted on average about $1.5 million per year throughout FY29 for additional companies that we would provide incentives for. And then we have about $7.8 million for Lower Kirby infrastructure. All of this is committed through agreements. We have the regional detention expansions that we've proposed with the district that we've agreed to finance. We have the White Road realignment, and then we have agreed through a development agreement, which I would also consider to be an incentive for a developer, to reconstruct Hooper and the second phase of Hooper and West Frugier Road. And so these roads would include water and sewer with them and drainage. Then we have the North Main Business Park, and this is a project we've worked on for many years at the southwest corner of State Highway 35 in North Main. This is $2.8 million with a developer who will be building roads, water, and building out a business park there. This is an area that's laid dormant for many, many years. The city has water, sewer services provided to this area, and this will be expanding the tax base of this area and spreading out the cost of services for more taxpayers. And then in here, we have about $9 million for Old Town Revitalization Plan implementation. As you know, we are currently working on an Old Town plan, so there's no commitment to this, but just put a marker in here for the next 4 or 5 years to have funds to implement that revitalization plan. And then the last area is that $5.7 million, and 4.9 of that is the Smith Ranch sanitary extension that I just mentioned. That's in our FY25 budget. And then we have also committed $800,000 with the developer to extend Wooten Road from Smith Ranch Road over to the 288 frontage road. The next slide, so we have $9.2 million in there, and this is what Trent was just mentioning a moment ago. So we've broken this down into 2 separate numbers, but the Broadway reconstruction, as you'll remember, we did a reimbursement agreement with the city some time ago that the EDC is funding The majority of the expenses is that would be incurred by the city. The city's responsible for 10% of the right-of-way cost. We have to do traffic signal upgrades. There's going to be some key intersections. We've identified about 3 of them that there'll have to be infrastructure put on beyond the scope of TxDOT's project. And then you also have approved our design work to make some streetscape improvements when the street's done. So that is $9.2 million that we have budgeted for that. And then, as Trent mentioned, we've got 18, which we think will be higher for the water and sanitary sewer relocation that will have to be done as a part of Phase 1. We have a good Phase 1 number of about $6 million right now. We put in $12 million for the Phase 2, which would be the part of the project east of Cullen Street. And so that is $18 million that would go on to the water ratepayers if it was not for the EDC doing that. And we're proposing to issue debt for that $18 million to relocate those lines. And then beginning in probably 2022, the board and council had a series of meetings to talk about, as I mentioned, that 20% recapitalization of existing infrastructure. So I think this goes right to those that are desirable to see our roads improved in our city. So these would all be projects with existing infrastructure that are in disrepair, and most of them just were never designed for the traffic they now handle. So that is $20.2 million over the next 5 years. And then $18.1 million in there for Hickory Slough, the $16.7 million. And then the other thing, as you'll remember that we agreed, is that we did a public hearing for it, and the EDC can pay for the operational cost of the park. So the EDC will also be contributing on an annual basis the operational cost of the sports complex, which will offset the general fund expense that the city would incur for the Parks Department. And then we are also paying for the equipment that goes into the park. And then we also made a commitment that we don't have an agreement yet with the city on, but the city, working with Harris County, received funding for 3.8 miles of Clear Creek Trail, and that is the city's match to that county agreement of $4.1 million. So the next slide just kind of summarizes, I think, which is page 110 or 105, somewhere in that range of the 5-year forecast that's in your packet. And you can see with these expenditures and revenue and expenses, we spend down a big portion of our fund balance in FY25, mostly with that Hickory Slough, if you want to identify one expense for it. Then you can see we spend down some more the next 2 years. But as you can see all the way through, we do run a positive cash balance through that, anywhere between $10 and $3 million. And the last slide, just summarizing all these expenditures that we're talking about are consistent with the priorities that we outlined in our Pearland Prosperity Strategic Plan to make Pearland the community of choice for people and business in our region. These highlighted projects alone, just the ones that I went through, represent about $103 million in infrastructure. Almost, the incentives would be the only one that you really are. The Old Town money may not be infrastructure, but the majority of that is all infrastructure. And just to give you an example, over the next 5 years, our sales tax revenue is expected to be about $80.4 million. So the forecast does include some reimbursements, and then the issuance of about $22.7 million in debt for Industrial Drive and the relocation of the water and sewer. And obviously there'll be other opportunities over the next 5 years for public-private partnerships that are outside these expenditures that we'll need to address at that time. But over a 5-year PDC, as I said, would maintain a positive fund balance while implementing projects that will strengthen our economy and expand our tax base. Thank you.
So just to highlight a couple of things as we kind of link this back to the enterprise fund we just talked about. The Smith Ranch Road utilities, the Old Town will include utilities, the 518 utilities, Lower Kirby, that always includes utilities, and then the 20% recapitalization projects. A lot of those are roads, but they also include utilities. So that's the areas where EDC is really helping out from a infrastructure standpoint on the enterprise fund. And then the general fund, the 20% recapitalization projects, those roads, that means we're not doing that out of the city's general fund, debt fund, as well as the other 518 improvements, the Hickory Slough Sportsplex and the trails. And then, of course, from an operating budget standpoint, it helps the city from a standpoint of once we've done the Hickory Slough Sportsplex, then the EDC is able to support the park's operating and equipment costs for operating Hickory Slough. And then we also make a transfer from EDC into the drainage fund. So they contribute to the drainage fund annually to help support that based on the amount of drainage infrastructure they've built over the life of the EDC. So I think we mentioned a minute ago whether we could do a big bond program out of the EDC, and I think what we saw there is about $103.6 million in infrastructure that is in the plans to be funded by the EDC. So with that, Mayor, hand it back to you and council. Thank you.
Trent, can I add one more thing?
Yes,
we also
please.
have the $435,000 in our budget for a portion of the city's master drainage plan update, and then we also have $350,000 for the parks plan update for 2025.
Thanks.
Yeah, 103 million is a number over time. Real quick, couple of comments. I don't know if I can't remember if this is in addition to or to help supplement, our side of things. I know we have a $2 million request into Congressman Babin on the Clear Creek Trail as a community project with him.
Correct.
I can't remember if that's on top of our number or if that's.
I think that would take a portion of our number off the cost there.
Right, because we've already received at least tentatively.
Half of it through Harris County.
Half of it through Harris.
So that's what the number in here with the EDC would be, the other half of what Harris County's funding. And I did want to, I should have mentioned this earlier, but wrapping up the EDC, typically we haven't gone into this kind of detail as part of our budget presentation or our budget workshops on the EDC, but we felt it was important to do this year like this. So because there's been a lot of questions of how you can utilize EDC dollars on infrastructure, and just show that the plan as it is and as it has been really incorporates a lot of infrastructure projects, and that the fund balance that the EDC is currently carrying, there is a plan, and a lot of these projects are on the books and are going to happen, and it will bring that fund balance down. These aren't projects that may happen like a lot of the ones with where we're going into building infrastructure for an incentive for a development. These are going to happen, so we will see that fund balance drawn down over the next couple of years.
Well, and I was going to say the $22 million over the next 5 years on recapitalization projects. Many of those are roads that probably have a PCI index of 50% or less on some of them. So that's certainly going to help with our PCI over the next 5 years. In addition to that, just a lot of our residents won't necessarily see these roads each and every day because they're more business related, but it is in our PCI. Every one of these roads are in the index. Just like out in the lower Kirby, you've got a few roads out there that are atrocious to drive on, that are going to be redone through our efforts as we expand business out there. So those will go into helping our PCI over time as well. They're just not going to be on roads necessarily that people drive through their neighborhoods, because that's where their dollars can't be used. So we'll see it over time as all of this working together. So, and I'm actually happy to see this level of EDC in the budget discussion, because I agree with you. We don't typically have this, but I think it's good to remind not only us, but our residents of what does the EDC contribute, that they may not see, they may not feel it, because we've offloaded the park, we've offloaded some of this water and sewer over to those budgets. So but it all impacts them at the end of the day. So we'll turn it open for questions. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. If you go back one slide, that ending fund balance, what's our policy or target for that ending fund balance?
10% of sales tax revenue. So we would be exceeding that on all the years.
Okay. So 10% of 15 million, 1.5 million?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay. So in that total revenue line, we're looking at proposed budget at 21.2. That includes 4.7 million of debt issuance?
Correct.
Okay. I'll call that to the new members. It gets misleading that we're gonna sell debt of 4.7 million, but call it revenue. So, yeah, wrap your head around that one. I guess what I would prefer is to scratch that, issuing that 4.7 million in debt. That drops our total revenue down. It'll just flow through the bottom line. We'll still be 4 or 5 times the balance we need to be.
As you'll remember, state law requires EDCs to have some level of debt to collect the sales tax.
Okay.
And so the current debt that we have, we will be retiring soon. So this project would be a project that we would need to do to continue to collect sales tax.
When's that last debt payment?
I believe it's FY '26.
Man, I struggled with that back when Chad was trying to pay debt off. Is you're essentially saying we have to have debt. If we're going to play that game, then let's go issue the smallest issuance we can. I think that's BS. So anyway, I'd like to see that next Monday when we reconvene. What if we do have to issue debt? What's the minimum? I don't know if that's more of a legal or. I know we've been through this before, but I don't want to go issue $4.7 million in debt just so we can have some debt. So it's all some nodding heads. I don't know if there's a consensus, but I'd like to see that for next Monday.
I would agree with that. Debt is debt at the end of the day, and if we have to have it for legal reasons, I totally understand that to maintain our PEDC, because we've seen the benefit of the EDC for the city and the way that it's been able to impact our community. But what is the minimum we have to stay legit and not get our hands slapped?
Questions?
Thanks, Matt. So what is the current fund balance of the 20% for the sales tax revenue allocation?
We don't have a separate fund for the 20%. We're just, averaging 20% over the time period. We don't have a set aside for the 20%, if that's the question.
So there's a number of projects that's allocated to. We look at the estimated cost of those projects and make sure on a rolling 5-year average, it's 20%. So each year we add additional projects on that last year to make sure we're maintaining that.
You may have less than 20% at any given moment because you're paying for engineering, but then here comes the project itself, and in a given year you may be over the 20%. Oh, I know. I was going to say, the answer to that. You were on there when it happened. Any other questions? You have. All right. That's good. Real quick, is any final questions on EDC? What's a wrap up after this? Just where we're headed?
Yeah, so all we're going to do is wrap up on what's the schedule going forward. So we're ready to move on.
Real quick, Ms. Kay, did you have something for next Monday night? A question?
For next Monday, if you're taking requests, the transfers out and in thing.
I think we've got that on our list, right? Okay, we've got that.
Mr. Cousin?
Thank you, Mayor. Matt, in our 20% that we got accomplished for helping out with the infrastructure stuff, is there any room to move to 25?
It would just depend on year to year over what projects we're doing and what other things council and the board wants us to do.
So there would be if it was in the right years.
Sure.
Okay. Just curious. Thank you.
And I would support looking at that.
I mean, obviously, we're going to start issuing debt for some things possibly or not. So, I mean, it's all, and then we have to have the projects. We have to have them designed and ready to build. Industrial Drive's been going round and round about drainage, but, just getting them on schedule. And these projects are challenging because they're in older areas, obviously.
Right. No, I was just curious if we were to move the needle 5% if there was room for it.
Is there a way we can use to build a park on Southtown instead of spending
on where?
On the Southtown.
Oh.
Can we use the EDC funds for that $900,000?
So we could, but right now we're not using general fund dollars. We're using park development funds.
Yeah, that's why
it's completely unrelated to the general fund budget. It's a different fund. One of the special revenue funds we'll go through next week.
Okay.
So it would not help the general fund at all.
Member Patel, that's why I asked that question.
All right, Trent, I think that's,
Thank you, Mayor. So just
Sorry,
running
one quick
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
Matt, would you say that you're already doing 25% in the next few years in infrastructure? 'Cause some of the project list I was looking at.
Well, yeah, on infrastructure, we're doing 60, 70%. I suppose it's a question of whether they're earmarked towards, which I assume Mr. Koza was talking about, was specifically in those older parts of the town that would not be just.
Okay, so
Yes,
you're
sir.
already doing the 25%. You're exceeding that, but
Well, for infrastructure, we're spending lots more.
Remember too, man, when we passed, when Jeff and I earmarked 20% annually every year, it doesn't have to be expensed that year, but annually 20% of the budget be utilized for infrastructure in the streets, the drainage, that type of stuff in that area. So what I was asking is, can we bump it, not what is being spent, whether it be for new development, any of that type of stuff, but in rehabbing our existing infrastructure that needs revitalization.
Yeah, that was a recapitalization of existing, and it kind of had some, I guess, target areas, the older parts of town, things like that. So while it is 60+% EDC spending on infrastructure, the ones like out in Lower Kirby, that's greenfield, new development that's opening that up for future development or working with developments, we don't count that towards that 20%. So, that we could look at the 20 to 25 on the older parts as well.
That was.
And I think
the recapitalization is set apart.
And I think one place we look at that is that Matt does have $9 million set aside for the results of the Old Town study.
Right.
And so that's one of those areas I think we could definitely make an impact.
Yeah, and that's what I was just asking, if we could, bump it up just a little bit, not.
would that include the redevelopment of Old Town?
That's what we were just talking about, that it could.
I would think that would qualify for what we call the recapitalization of existing.
It would, but it would increase the.
And it would increase the percentage for sure.
Gotcha. All right.
Currently at that 22 and a half or whatever that number is over 5 years, that's a little over 20%, 20 to 25%. If you add another 9 to that, that's a significant increase in the percentage.
Right.
But those dollars, we don't know what that 9 would be spent on, so we're waiting to see after the study what needs to be there.
Yes, sir.
All right. Last call, is that it?
All right. Next up, just a quick preview for what we have in store for us for the remainder of tonight. On tonight's council agenda, we do have a couple of items on there that set the public hearing dates for both the budget and the tax rate. And then on the tax rate, we set our maximum tax rate. While our proposed tax rate is 63.5 cents, we recommend setting that max tax rate, and that's what we publish as the max, at the current tax rate, the 65.54. What that gives is if there is a desire to add something to the infrastructure fund for streets, that gives us the ability to go above the 63.5 we're proposing as part of the budget. But by no means are we proposing that. It's just giving some leeway as we move forward. Our recommended budget is on the 63.5 rate. So those are the three things we'll do tonight. We'll come back next Monday on the 19th with budget discussion number 2. We will walk through all your questions from tonight. We'll cover those special revenue funds like CVB and Park Development Fund and the Drainage Fund, as well as the other things we mentioned earlier. And then if necessary, we'll come back on the 26th for a final budget discussion, and then we'll be into September when we start going through our public hearings and first readings of the budget and the tax rates on September 9th and September 23rd. So coming at us real fast, but we'll be working hard over the next several weeks to get all your questions answered and everything else you need to make these final decisions. So appreciate your time this afternoon. I think it was very productive. And again, thank all of our departments and our budget team that helped put this together.
So Trent, real quick on those questions that were asked tonight, like in past years, is there going to be a running list of that out on the website for the public to see, as
Yes.
well as us to see? And
So
where's that going to be?
Similar to the previous years, it's already set up. We'll have on there the presentation from the night. We'll link to the discussions, and then we'll drop in there any memos we publish answering questions, anything, and just kind of capture the entire budget process.
Yeah, and I just want to make that, for those that may be watching online or see this later, on video, that will be out on the budget page for you to view. So as we've asked those questions, a running total, even if we have a question that comes up in the meantime and we send that to staff, those get added to that ongoing list, so you can see the answers to those. So with that, we will call for adjournment at 5:24.